So, Doctor Sleep. The title's a total lie. He's not a doctor and he doesn't work at a sleep clinic. Worst movie ever. Don't watch it. It's a lie. Okay, I'm just joking. I'm just joking. Seriously though, I don't understand what the title's really a reference to. To be perfectly honest, someone calls him Doctor Sleep at some point in the movie with no context, but it is kind of annoying. I guess Doctor Sleep sounds cool, like Doctor Feelgood or something, but I don't know. So this is a sequel to The Shining. I'm not sure if it's more supposed to be a sequel to the novel or the movie The Shining. I think they're a bit different. I've never read the Shining novel because, frankly, I can't sit through a Stephen King book. But nevertheless, it's a sequel. So, out of the gate, this film, I think, faces a very difficult uphill challenge because the original is generally regarded as being one of, if not the greatest horror films of all time. And you can say what you want about Kubrick. Personally, I'm not sure how well 2001: A Space Odyssey has aged. Because, I mean, it still is very visually impressive, but it is very, very slow. And I almost fell asleep the last time I was watching it. But I think regardless of how you feel about Kubrick, you have to admit his work was all very revolutionary. He was an incredibly skilled director. So going into a sequel to a Kubrick film, you have to immediately try to live up to the reputation. If nothing else, you want to make it so people don't think this is just a cheap cash-in on the original. That you're not just making this because people like The Shining and enough people will see this that your film will scrape by on and make a bare profit. I mean, there's good reboots and there's bad reboots and there's good long-term sequels and there's bad long-term sequels. The Terminator franchise, for instance, has been garbage to me since Terminator 2, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. Whereas the Blade Runner sequel is one of my favorite movies of all time. I thought it was incredible. I actually thought it was better than the original. So that felt like a movie that they just wanted to make, and there was like real passion that went into it. And it wasn't just a soulless cash-in on one of the most iconic science fiction movies of all time. So does it live up to this? Is it just a cheap cash-in, or is it kind of its own film that can stand on its 2 feet? Honestly, it's very much a mixed bag. And it's kind of frustrating because I think the single biggest issue with this is how long it is. It's like 2.5 hours. Let me just look up the exact running time. This movie is 152 minutes, so it's 2.5 hours long. I almost fell asleep a couple times during this film just because of how slow it is. I think you could easily cut half an hour out of this movie and not even notice it. And it would just flow a lot better. I think overall it would just be a much better film for it. I mean, I guess that makes it a more faithful adaptation of a Stephen King novel as it just kind of rambles on and doesn't really go anywhere. So I guess that's kind of immediately my problem with it. My other main issue with this is it does very much try to cash in on the original movie with just references and then spoiler alert. They go to the Overlook Hotel at the end of the movie for no adequately explored reason. And it's just like, oh, remember this other movie? We're just going to keep showing you clips from that movie because that movie was like really good and people really liked it and it was really iconic. So we're just going to recreate some scenes from that movie, kind of like what they did in Ready Player One, because we don't have anything else. So it's kind of a mixed bag because you had pretty good performances from Ewan McGregor, Cliff Curtis. I don't know why a Maori is in New Hampshire, wherever, but he did a good job. Ewan McGregor always does a good job. The premise is interesting. I mean, it doesn't feel phoned in. It just feels like it's struggling to have an identity, and they made some bad decisions when they were making the film. It also is kind of misery porn, but I guess that's kind of part of the core for Stephen King. So maybe let's start getting into the plot. So this movie takes place a long time after the incidents of The Shining, And an issue I've always kind of had with The Shining, and this to a certain extent, is it really feels like it's part of some bigger fictional universe. And you kind of have all this, like, unmentioned lore in the background that's just not very developed. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I just think it's weird to have all this, like, background stuff, and particularly in this movie, to kind of develop it if it's not really intended to be part of a larger franchise, or maybe it was and this movie just flopped. Anyways, so Danny Torrance from the original Shining is tormented by various ghosts from his experiences in the first movie, and he learns to put them into boxes from Dick Halloran, who is the guy who was kind of his mentor in the first movie. And it's just like, okay, do we really need to go through this again? Okay, we get it. It was a traumatic experience. It's going to haunt him a bit. But it's like, once again, do we really have to retread everything from the original movie? If you're watching this, you probably saw the original movie. I just kind of want to move on with the plot to this film. So Danny has been going on a drinking binge, and we don't really know what he's been doing for the last 30 years, but apparently he's just been getting high and drunk the whole time and just having sex with random women. And it starts out like with this really dark scene where he has sex with some woman from a club, and she steals all the money out of his wallet. And after she steals the money out of his wallet, they get high on coke together, and then he tries to steal money from her, but he just leaves her there. And it's implied later in the movie that she dies choking on her own vomit, and her kid, who's there as well, starves to death. So for whatever reason, he just decides to ride the bus as far as he can go. And then he goes to a small town in New Hampshire, and the Maori guy takes him in under his wing, and he becomes his Alcohol Anonymous sponsor, and he starts working at like a kid's park, and then eventually he starts working at a hospice with dying patients. And I guess that's where he gets the name Dr. Sleep, because he comforts them. And then we kind of like have a time jump where it's 8 years later. And despite it being 8 years later, everybody's the exact same age. I don't know if it was really necessary to have that big a time jump. It's kind of weird, but whatever. And then we're introduced to the True Knot, which is a really lame name, who is a group of psychic vampires that eat people with the Shining. Because apparently when people with the Shining die, they turn into steam, and the steam keeps them eternally young. However, supposedly the number of people with the Shining have been decreasing because they've just started medicating people who have it, thinking it's schizophrenia or something. And they're kind of gradually dying of not having enough steam or enough life essence. So as they're going through this, they uncover Abra, who's a little girl who has the most shining potential any of them have ever seen. And the cult tries to get a fix on her, but Abra is so powerful she succeeds in throwing the leader of the cult, played by Rebecca Ferguson, out of her head. Her name is Rose the Hat, which is lame, but it's very Stephen King-esque. So Dan makes contact with Abra, and he starts to kind of explain things to her. This is a kind of a part of the film I wish they would have spent more time on instead of kind of the long stretches of nothing. The relationship between Danny and Abra, and how she it's kind of a touching thing. It's kind of a redemptive thing for Danny, and I kind of like the mentor element. It's very much like what you had in the first film. So he eventually kind of figures out that this cult is going after her, and Abra has a vision where there's a boy who gets killed and tortured to death, and then his steam is consumed by the cult. But then the cult decide that they're going to go after Abra. Now they just have to figure out where she is. So for some reason, Danny tells his best buddy about the Shining, and then they go to the place where the boy's mutilated body is, and this is kind of like where the movie starts to get bogged down. And it's like, it just kind of meanders because they're like building it up. They're building it up. The cult's coming from Abra. They got to get ready. The cult's coming. There's like a lot of 4D chess that goes along, and basically Danny and the Maori guy succeed in luring the cult into a trap, and they kill the vast majority of them with deer rifles. I think they miss two of them, but they basically kill the cult in like 5 seconds. Although Danny's best friend gets mind controlled into shooting himself in the head for some reason. But it's like, okay, so the cult's dead except for two people. What are they going to do now? So then the second in command of the cult, because Rose didn't come with them because Abra could sense her or something. Like I said, it's kind of getting into like a mess at this point in time. He kidnaps Abra, but then Danny succeeds in rescuing her. And the scene is kind of funny because he has Abra in the back seat and she's drugged up. And Danny points out that the guy at the front thinks because he's an immortal, there's no point in wearing a seatbelt. So like Danny deliberately crashes the car and he goes through the front windshield and smashes his head in. So now all we really have left, because like Abra's parents are dead, Danny's best friend is dead, all the cult except for Rose are dead. So it's like we're gonna have this face off now. So they're gonna have to somehow survive. And this is really when the movie gets into being just a shameless reference to the original, probably so they would have stuff for the trailers. And he's like, okay, I know this place that's dangerous to people like me, and it'll be more dangerous to people like her. So we're gonna go to the Overlook Hotel and we're gonna trap her there. And they're like, this is a brilliant idea. Like why? Because you want to, it's just like, it's solely because they want to reshoot some iconic scenes and use the footage for the trailer. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't really play that much of a role, in my humble opinion. So they go there and they set up like this 4D chess plan. Rose consumes pretty much all of the steam she has left to become like a super powerful super being. And they do like a whole bunch. And admittedly, kind of one of the cooler things of this movie is they make good use of the shining powers, like messing with each other's heads, like trapping each other inside of memories, making people think things are there that aren't there, that kind of thing. We have a really, really lame face-off between Danny and Rose where he just gets his ass kicked. But it turns out that it was all part of like a plan. And so he's been seeing the ghosts from the Overlook Hotel for a really long period of time. And he's been taught to, he's been trained himself to lock them up in boxes. So he tricks Rose to go inside his head, and she thinks he's keeping treasures in there or steam or something else important. So she opens up the boxes and lets all the starving ghosts out. So the ghosts completely consume her. And that's how they beat her, and it's kind of lame. It's just, once again, you have to rely on the original movie for everything in this. And then Danny becomes possessed like Jack Nicholson was in the first movie, and we get a repeat of some of those scenes. And then Danny kind of regains himself, and he goes, okay, you got to get out of here. I'm gonna blow this place up and take myself with it, because we were only able to make one mediocre sequel off of this. We have to make sure that no one will make another mediocre Shining sequel ever again. So he blows up the hotel. Abra escapes. And after that happens, we have one scene at the end where Abra is talking to Danny and I think her father, and it's confirmed that the afterlife does exist. So what can I say about this film? It has potential. The actors do a pretty good job. There's a lot of like themes that could be explored here. There's a lot of interesting aspects to the film, but ultimately it's just kind of completely reliant upon the original work. And that's something that people aren't really familiar with, at least my generation. I mean, I'm sure film aficionados like me have seen it a couple times. But I don't know if the average millennial or even maybe the average Gen X has seen The Shining. So, and baby boomers don't normally like horror movies that much. So it's like, I don't know who the target audience of this film is. I mean, the Blade Runner reboot didn't do particularly well either, but there's a large ingrained audience for sci-fi who will just come out and see a sci-fi film, particularly if it's kind of like an epic blockbuster, regardless of how familiar they are with the source material. So overall, if I had to give this movie a rank out of 10, I'd probably give it like a 5 or a 5.5. Keep in mind, for me, a 5 is like an average movie. So I'd probably give this like a 5.5. If they edited it properly, that would probably go up to a 6.5. Because editing is this film's like most egregious sin. It doesn't really feel finished, in my opinion. So that's kind of how I feel about The Shining. I hope you enjoyed this review. Sorry, not The Shining, Doctor Sleep. And I'll talk to you guys later.